Our next speaker is one of those who's flown halfway around the world, so I want to thank him again for being with us. He is executive editor at Columbia Journalism Review, and he will be talking about facing a Trumpist audience, Donald Trump yet again. Please, Sewell Chan, join us on stage.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Bonjour. I am not a neuroscientist, but I learned so much from Professor Karaki's presentation. I'm afraid I'm not sure we're at the peak of Mount Stupid yet. We may still have to do more climbing before we can descend the mountain. But I'm very, very pleased to be here today and speaking at Sciences Po for the first time. How do we begin? There we go. So hello, I'm Sewell Chan. I joined the Columbia Journalism Review, which was founded in 1961. I joined about 3 months ago after 3 years leading a nonprofit newsroom in the state of Texas, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so I was really, during the first Trump administration in London and then Los Angeles, and then obviously the lead up to this election I've spent in Texas and now back in New York. So I definitely hope to share some insights. The structure of the talk today is as follows. I want to talk a little bit about trust as a complicated story, that it's not as simple as we sometimes think, and that we subscribe as journalists still to some false binaries, I think, to some models of thinking about trust that I think are outdated. I'll talk about the hyperpolarization and partisanization of news, because right now we're facing a situation of really siloed realities in the United States where not just what you consume, but what platforms you choose to consume it on determines your mental map of the world. And I learned so much from Professor Karaki's talk about the human needs that are met by fake news or misinformation, but to choose a more neutral term, people's choice of platforms and of publications and news outlets that meet certain needs that they have for certainty or fulfillment or a sense of belonging. Then we'll talk a little bit about Trump, how the U.S. press handled Trump 1, and what we might be able to do better. Might is a big word in Trump 2, and then, of course, discuss journalism's values at a time of challenge. So the story of Americans' trust in mass media is not unfamiliar to anyone here. Since the Watergate era, which I would also call the Watergate aberration, trust in U.S. institutions in general has been declining for multiple decades. So I always, when I'm asked about what can we do about the crisis of trust, I always like to talk about the set of institutional factors, because trust in the judiciary has declined, trust in medicine and law has declined, trust in legal institutions has declined, trust in science has declined. And we're at a point where I think the military in the U.S. remains the most trusted institution. We can talk about how problematic that is. And but the picture for the U.S. is really one where trends that were underway already for several decades accelerated and kind of metastasized over the last decade. So you're seeing that the proportion of people who say not just that they occasionally mistrust the news, but that it's not at all useful has really sharply risen, which should disturb us. Equally significantly, there has always been a partisan gap in trust of news media, again, going back to the Nixon era, but as you can see that during that era, the gap was small. The gap began to widen substantially in the 1990s, and it's become, a chasm of a gap, with every successive president, Clinton, Obama, Trump's first administration, and the gap remains extremely wide today. And I think that's a big part of the problem, that many mainstream U.S. news organizations, I think, effectively are addressing people sympathetic to the Democratic Party, whereas Republicans are fleeing to an entirely different ecosystem. Okay. Now, these are not journalism's only myths, but I love, and I can't wait to hear Joshua Dar later today because he's a brilliant media historian, has a lot to offer. But I love this book, Why Americans Hate the Media So Much. This was published in 2011, so it is remarkably relevant today. One is this idea that trust was the norm. Like, there was this golden era of Walter Cronkite and trust, and he told you what the news was, and most Americans believed it. It was not kind of that. There was an era of greater consensualism, but it was actually the aberration, not the norm. Secondly, that news should be prestigious. that news should be a prestige profession of people who are, really kind of, at the top of their society. Well, most journalists have often been people who are like somewhat despised. And if you have a longer view of what journalism is, a longer view of what reporting is, you see that this post-war era of journalism as a profession, and we have these discussions today. When Columbia Journalism School was founded in 1912, the idea that journalism was a profession that you studied and could get credentials in was actually kind of controversial, right? Previously, many people who went to journalism did not even have a college degree. That started to change in the late 19th century, and then, of course, more professionalization starting a century ago. A third myth is that trust was higher because journalists were simply better. And that's not really a myth that's grounded kind of in much reality. In reality, there was much less media choice, less competition, and of course, not all voices were heard, especially those of women, people of color, etc. And then again, this idea that trust is binary, rather than being a spectrum, that trust is not, in my view, an off and on switch of trusted versus not trusted. I think the generalized state is mistrust, and the question is to what extent. This study last year really interested me because when I think about the institutions in American journalism, several of which I've worked at, including the New York Times and the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times. I spent 21 years of my career at those places. I've even been an intern at the Wall Street Journal. I love this statistic that, in fact, the Weather Channel, now, even since 2023, that may have changed, because apparently you may have heard about these threats that meteorologists faced last year in talking about the connection between extreme weather and climate change. Some of them got threats saying, don't talk about climate change, you can't attribute any one weather event to climate. But this is really a startling statistic that even what we regard as our most trusted journalism institutions in the US are not all that trusted. Okay. Where do we see a bigger picture here? And this is why I'm so glad Josh Starr is speaking later. We are seeing a better picture for local news, not much better, but generally the level at which people are ready to rate local news, to rate trust as being higher, is local government and local politics. And so it's a little bit like Congress. When you ask people, do you approve? The answer is no. When you ask people about your individual congressperson, the answer is, well, maybe, sometimes. Again, similarly, the partisan gap in trust is a little bit less at the local level. Okay. I'm going to tick very quickly through this. I think a big part of the conversation has to be about the decline of local news in America. It has contributed to the trust crisis because we've had a nationalization of the U.S. news market. We're a nation across 5 time zones, great amount of diversity, and yet most of our, quote, news comes from now these national sources, and that has contributed to the decline of trust, which is strongest again at the local level. Obviously, I don't need to tell this audience that newspapers are only going to be an important part, but a small part of addressing the challenge. I mean, newspaper employment in the U.S. is declining, and obviously people working for all digital news sources is likely going to be the future for quite a while. Okay. Now, what made this election distinctive? I think when it's remembered from a media perspective, we're going to think about the interviews. I love that Professor Karaki referred to the fact that there had just been one debate. I think these are probably the best known interviews. This is not with 60 Minutes. This is not with the New York Times. It's, Joe Rogan and Trump, bullshitting for 3 hours. And also, but Harris as well, who was very kind of avoidant of kind of mainstream news. Her encounters with podcasters were kind of highly controlled, and I think that actually you saw the outcome of really a president who is really willing to kind of just spew on for hours, even if he doesn't make much sense, and that didn't have as much of an impact as many people thought it would. And I think that's really, really worth reflecting on, that we're in a very non-linear time for people to think about processing information. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this trend because I think one of the biggest trends out of 2020, I feel that every presidential election in the U.S. is associated with a kind of breakthrough medium. Twitter in 2008. I think the breakthrough medium right now is actually not a platform. It's not Blue Sky yet. It's not really X, although X played a big role. It's really more the idea that people are if you look at studies like Reuters Institute, even from 5 or 10 years ago, people would say they get news from social media, but they don't trust it very much. No, now they're trusting news from social media, or they're trusting their TikTok, podcast, and YouTube. And so what we saw in this election was that those who got their news from newspapers or national network news voted for Harris, a majority. Those who got their news primarily from YouTube, TikTok, or podcasts, some kinds of podcasts, voted more for Trump. So there was a real split, not only according to the choice of publication, but according to the medium. We're also seeing, of course, among younger people, a heavy rise in news influencers being important in affecting how they think, and those news influencers are not partisan. It's not partisanly even. This was also a big information. You could call it misinformation. You can call it fake news. I call it a kind of perception gap. That people's perceptions of crime, inflation, and immigration in particular varied widely according to what news they consume. And as you can see in this chart, and I'm happy to share these slides afterward, those who consumed certain media, including Fox, obviously had a very different perception of reality. So in a way, this was less an election about sentiment, I would argue, than an election about what information reality you were in. It's also clear that Americans who kind of had more access to facts, tended to vote more Democratic. And I think, and again, they tended to rate Harris more highly if they actually knew about more policies. Now I'm going to turn for the rest of my presentation to what to expect. This is a long list of actions that I'm not going to read through, but I'm just going to suggest that you have a phenomenon now of Trump unleashed. You have this, not only the FBI director, but I was on a call last night with major media lawyers in the U.S. There's a lot of worry about everything on this list: the defunding of public media, an attack on traditional norms of dealing with the press, a continuing belittling of the press. Recently, there was the new White House press secretary coming in. She was sent a pretty innocuous email from a Washington Post reporter. And instead of responding to the email, she shared the email with her audience to say, see, the Washington Post can't even ask a balanced question. So this is really a norm violation. In the past, the idea that you would take a reporter's question, not answer it, and then go and attack the reporter and direct many followers to attack them, really would have be considered outside the norm. And so the norms are changing right now. There's going to be a big part of the regulatory and legal aspect that's going to be big. And then, of course, the worst case scenario, as you see at the end of this slide, is the idea of incitement of violence. And let's hope, of course, that it does not get there. I think some of the lessons that I took away from Trump 1, fact-checking is essential, but it's not adequate. The U.S. press is not very unified as a set of institutions. We don't stand up together united as a pro-democratic practice, and maybe we should do that. There are bright spots. There are institutions that help bring the U.S. together to defend press rights, but those institutions are going to have to be much stronger in the years to come. I'm on the board of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, which is at the frontier of doing that work. I think there's a false binary that's emerged between whether you can do insider or access journalism or cover the people, and it's obviously not either or, it's both. A lot of the critiques that liberals have leveled against the press are too much focus on the inside game, not enough on kind of covering the country. And I think the reality, as someone who's worked in New York and DC as well as Texas and California, is you have to do both. Triviality, exaggeration, sensationalism, the tendency to take Trump's words very seriously, even when he's not always very serious about those words, I think remains a very disturbing phenomenon, that we continue to cover Trump literally, and as a result, maybe we're not covering Trumpism seriously enough. I think also on a business model level, organizations that benefited from the so-called Trump bump in 2016 and 17 did not necessarily use those years to then really invest in building out audiences. One company I think that did use the Trump bump effectively was the New York Times, which after all that surge of new readers, they also built out new products, recipes, cooking, games. I recently heard the person who oversees cooking saying that the more, there's like talk about civil war, the more people want to cook roast chicken really well. And it was very funny, but it was this idea that at times of stress that people are actually looking for a more balanced news diet. Except for the New York Times, most news organizations have not provided that. And then, of course, a big concern I think that out of the first Trump era is this idea of not covering history and comparative politics nearly well enough. So what can we do better in Trump 2? First of all, focus on the actions, not just the actors. Conveying the stakes, which Jay Rosen says, don't cover the odds, cover the stakes. What will happen? What is its impact on ordinary people? Get outside of the coast. There's a typo here. Take the high road, I meant, not the high ride. Save our criticisms for true emergencies. Communicate journalism's positive role and benefit, which in the U.S. does not happen nearly enough. And I don't think the U.S. has even though we have the First Amendment, I don't think the norm of viewing the press as a pillar of democracy is actually where it should be. We are not at war, we're at work. But as Richard Toffel wrote for us in CJR recently, the former CEO of ProPublica, if we do end up going to war, prepare to fight. And that having that legal infrastructure to defend freedom of information, to defend access to public information is more important than ever. And then, of course, covering democratic erosion in a global perspective. And I think that's very important for the U.S. right now, which tends to be very inward-looking and is in an isolationist moment. Looking at the populist authoritarian trend in America in comparative perspective is more important than ever. Part of what I encountered in Texas, where I lived, in a state filled with Trump voters and talked to many people who were very skeptical of the press, I learned certain things. One of them is you have to assume a certain baseline level of skepticism, that you have to be clear, articulate, and precise in defending journalism's value. Transparency is key. No one likes a phony. Do not pretend to be someone that you're not. But I find the transparency criticism interesting because when you look at disadvantaged communities like people of color or left behind communities, and you look at Trump and you look at conservatives, and of course there's a lot of overlap, both communities, their biggest complaint is a lack of transparency, and that should say something to us. I think it's important to support trust-based initiatives like the Journalism Trust Initiative. I think it's important to move away from ratings and virality as a measure of true impact. And it's finally important to take a very, very long view of how trust gets rebuilt. I also want to point out that 8 of the 10 fastest growing states in the U.S. are so-called red states. I know red in France doesn't make sense because it's the color of the left everywhere in the world except the United States. But this idea that the U.S. is actually, in a way moving away towards states like New York, California, Illinois. And so we have to represent the country if we're going to re-earn the country's trust. Okay. When do our values matter the most? Of course, they matter the most when they're challenged, which is why this period, people often talk about Watergate as being this kind of high water mark for how institutions should function. And in many ways, it was a high water mark, but it also meant that the Watergate era, even though we see it as a model, was actually an affirmation that institutions were working. Now we're at a time of profound institutional dysfunction. Should that lead us to despair? No, it should not. It should actually lead us to take the moment very seriously, because I would argue that in the U.S. we have not faced an anti-democratic phenomenon, an anti-press phenomenon, anti-democratic especially, so really since the 1930s. Now, when you take the long view of U.S. history, again, the long view, in the late 19th century, Ida Wells was covering lynchings. No one else was. Elijah Parrish Lovejoy was the first martyr to the U.S. press. He was murdered for running an abolitionist press in the 1840s. And so the idea of illiberalism, up through the civil rights movement, journalists were kind of persecuted and often violently attacked. So my argument is that, again, seeing the norm as being this kind of lost post-war era, and that coming from it as a sense of loss, it's understandable from a human perspective, but it's actually not the right framework we should be taking. We need to have a longer framework, and one that looks at the early 20th century, the late 19th century, and looks at challenges to democracy, especially in the US, as being kind of cyclical and periodic and regular. We have to take that very, very seriously. We also have to tell our story better, the story of our craft. My final slide is a little bit about what I learned in Texas. First of all, the maps, the blue state map should be abolished because in reality, if you look by counties, America looks very, very red. Trump made gains even in major cities. But of course, the major divides now include urban and rural. They include gender, education, and religion, not just race, class, and region. So we have to look at polarization in a much more complex way. I don't like it anymore when people say, why do Americans always vote against their interests? You know, and they talk about the Thomas Frank book, What Happened in Kansas, which was 20 years ago now. Great book, but times have changed. When Americans, the only major social and demographic group where Kamala Harris improved on 2020 was among college-educated whites making over $100,000 a year. We love college-educated whites who make over $100,000 a year, but that's actually not obviously either the basis for a Democratic Party to succeed nationwide, nor is it the basis for a news audience that we need paying close attention to news. So I think we have to take seriously how do people define their interests, and what are the psychic and social ways in which they define their interests, not just economic ones. As the last professor said, you know, fact-checking does matter, but it does need to be contextualized. Simply saying that's not true or saying, okay, this is the correct fact, that's not persuading people. It's wonderful that the Washington Post documented 35,000 lies that Donald Trump said in his first administration. But to be frank, I'm not sure that documenting 35,000 more lies at this point is going to change anyone's minds. Information fragmentation is the norm. The idea of a mass unified audience, I think it's not necessarily dead, but it cannot be the start of our framework. And then finally, pandering is not the same as respect. I think some of the changes that we need in American journalism include the bringing into the craft of people with a much broader set of life experiences and a broader set of truly diverse backgrounds. If journalism is seen as an elite activity, and believe me, it's being portrayed as such, the consequences are not going to be good, because people ultimately need to see journalists as being on the side of citizens, on the side of ordinary Americans, and not as these kind of elite actors with a special set of interests. And that's one of the biggest dangers that we face right now. Sorry to go on a bit, but I'm thrilled to take questions. Thank you very much, and please contact me if you would like the slides.
Thank you very much, Sewell Chan. So we will be taking your questions. Again, if you have questions, please do get up and make your way to the microphones in the alleys. If it's too difficult for you to get up, we will get a mic to you, get you VIP mic service coming your way. We'll take your question first. Please introduce yourself before your question.
Hi, I'm Juliette. I'm a student here in the Masters, and thank you so much. It was very interesting. And I was wondering what you thought about the Washington Post not endorsing or any candidate in the U.S. election.
Yeah, both the owners of the Washington, thank you for the great question. The owners of the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times made that decision. By the way, I used to be the editorial page editor of the Los Angeles Times, and I worked for the owner. And as I wrote in CJR, I respect the owner's right, the prerogative to make the decision not to endorse. That is their right, and historically editorial pages represent the publisher or owner's viewpoint. But I thought the timing and the manner by which the endorsement was canceled was terrible. If you're going to say in 2023 we're not going to endorse for president anymore, I think that would have been fine. It would have been accepted. But when you say 6 weeks, 2 weeks before the election, oh, we have an endorsement written, but we're not going to publish it, it seemed like cowardice. And I think it really scared so many people. And I was startled that 200,000 people, I think, left their Washington Post subscriptions. And that was a strong example of reader protest. So I think it's very disturbing. And I think we have to see if that trend will continue. Yes.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. I have a question about fact-checking, because you mentioned it quickly, but you said it was essential but inadequate, and I was wondering how can we deal with that contradiction? Do we still need to do fact-checking, or do we need to have a different approach?
Well, we still need to, great question. We still need to fact-check in that, we're a profession that's grounded in precision, accuracy, insight, and context. So every day we fact check like the way we breathe as journalists, right? To be a journalist is to be fact checking, including checking your own assumptions. So I think that's has to be core to our daily practice. What I was trying to say was that fact checking alone, up through 2020, we were publishing articles saying fact check, the 2 points, and then what is the real fact? I'm not sure that's working, because I think a lot of people who voted for Trump, they know that he doesn't really have the facts, but they think that he speaks to a kind of larger truth. And so in other words, they're not taking him necessarily at the literal factual level. So if we're only at the literal factual level, we're not challenging or engaging that broader question of how truth is perceived. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, on the left side again. Yeah, please, if you can introduce yourself.
I'm Grace, thank you for this. So I'm American, as you can tell by my accent, and I've kind of noticed in my personal and professional life what you were talking about with, specifically with Joe Rogan and Alex Cooper. I've noticed a lot of people have kind of thrown their trust into them because it's personal, and I've seen a lot, I believe them wholeheartedly kind of without doing the work behind it, and that always leads me to the question of media literacy. Yeah. Because I think without media literacy, you don't know who to trust and why to trust them or not. I just wanted to know what you think the future is like for media literacy education, or building a media literacy base in the States will look like in the coming years.
Yeah, there's something called the News Literacy Project, which is really worth supporting in the U.S. Unfortunately, the U.S. teaches kindergarten through 12th grade education is not very strong. And we do not teach news literacy, civic literacy, or financial literacy. And I think that failure to teach information literacy has become very systemic. I'm not confident that will come through the school systems, which are under attack in other ways. What I do think needs to happen, though, is families and communities need to teach information literacy better. I do think that there's a shift that's going on long term where trust is moving away from institutions toward individuals. So it doesn't surprise me in a way that people might see Alex Cooper or Joe Rogan as like a friendly guide to the news. What we have to do who work in journalism is to actually develop ourselves the capacity to be trusted voices that people will trust, recognizing that the move is away from trusting an institution and toward trusting a personality.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chan. So in 2017, once again about Washington Post, the Post made like the slogan of democracy dies in darkness. And now we see what's going on with Jeff Bezos not endorsing Kamala Harris. So would you say that this time is going to be different? The Trump bump that gave a new wave of subscribers, of reinforcement of the media role, do you think this time is just going to be different?
Well, if you're asking, does the slogan "democracy dies in darkness" still apply? It applies, of course. I actually think, though, that it's very ironic that Bezos chose that slogan. He chose it. Marty Baron did not choose it, the editor. In fact, he thought it was a little bit corny. But Bezos chose it, and then the Washington Post, which has had a lot of economic and audience challenges, that the withdrawal of the endorsement, to get to the first question, really, really worried people about that. So look, it's very important in any election not to take away overly broad generalizations. 300,000 people voting differently in 3 states would have changed the outcome of this election. So I don't think it's suddenly like there's a consensus against democracy in the US. I don't think that's the case. But rather, I think some of the assumptions that Democrats made and some of the assumptions that journalism made, that it couldn't happen again, that 2016 was a one-off, that Trump was the aberration, he is not who we are. Well, now he's won the popular vote, so he's not who all of us are. But the simplistic notion that he's un-American, I think that's what has been undermined.
So we do have a question on this side. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Leila. If viralization is no longer a measure of impact to win back audience and trust, what is a great measure of impact to aim as a journalist?
Well, so at the Texas Tribune, we were a nonprofit, we were not commercial, there was no paywall, and we were based on donations. So we did look at traffic because we wanted to reach a lot of people with our free, high-quality journalism that's not behind a paywall. But one of the things we did was, instead of aiming for virality, what we tried to do was we had a lot of events. Even though Texas is a state of 30 million people, it's the size of a country, but we had, a lot of events and in-person gatherings. We decided to tell stories through more than just the website. So I think events can play a role. I think that we also have to look at journalists. Journalists are not great at telling the stories of what journalism accomplished. I think if a policy is changed or if a decision is made differently because of journalism, we should be proudly telling that story. We cannot assume that people will figure it out on their own. But it's a really, really tough question, right? I think we went too far seeing millions of page views as being a measure of impact. And that's not real. It's a measure of something. But I'm not sure it's a true measure of the impact journalists are trying to have in a democratic society.
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello, Mr. Chan. Thank you for your presentation. You talked about Watergate being the starting point for the decline of trust in media, while journalists were...
Sorry, about what being the start?
Watergate.
Oh, Watergate, sorry, yeah.
While journalists were the backbone of these revelations, how can you explain that journalists suffer from the general distrust in the institutions while being the ones who reveal the scandals that rocked these institutions in the first place?
Well, that's a really, really good question, isn't it? I don't have a simple answer to that. Again, as I said earlier, I think trust in institutions in general has declined. Look, you have a really good point. People still consume news, and they say they don't trust it. So I think part of us, and if there's social scientists here, I'd love some help on this. Like, there is a divide, I think, between people saying, oh, I don't trust the news, but then they read the news. And so I do think that some of the trust numbers I showed earlier, although very significant, I think part of that is how questions are asked. Everyone in America, right, it's very fashionable to say, I don't trust anything. It's become super fashionable to say that. And so I think sometimes that's the response people give even as they're reading the news. It's a really perceptive observation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Gilles Bruno, I work in a journalism school also, and you said about lessons of Trump. One, fact-checking is essential but inadequate. All major journalism schools teach fact-checking, obviously.
Yeah.
So could you explain a bit more what is it, do you talk about the culture of the journalist that is doing fact-checking live in front of a political person?
Yeah.
What is exactly your point about that?
For example, during the debates, right? Trump is very hard to fact-check lies because, he tells a lot of mistruths. So I'm going to put the live aside for a moment. I think the fact-checking is important. As I said earlier, fact-checking should be like breathing for journalists. However, it's not enough without contextualization when we're presenting the facts. I think there was a fetishization of fact-checking starting about 10, 15 years ago. And the idea was if we simply said what was the truth and pointed out the volume and the velocity and the frequency of the lies, somehow people would be like, oh my gosh, there's so many lies out there, I'm going to change my mental model differently. But I don't think that's what's happened. I think a lot of people have assimilated a certain amount of mistruth and misinformation into their information reality. So they're like, if Washington Post says, oh, well, Trump told 30,000 lies, they're like, okay, but the Democrats lie too. And they're not that concerned about the number. So all I'm saying is we absolutely need to check facts in our own work and in the sources who present information to us. It's crucial. the foundation of our craft. But we can't rely on fact-checking alone as self-evident. That if we do our job, if we just check the facts carefully enough, the readers will notice, the voters will notice, because that's no longer the case.
Final question, Rudy Rudenberg.
Rudy Rudenberg, freelance journalist, also teacher here at the school. Interesting enough, of course, just a side point that fact-checkers are no longer being trusted anymore.
Are no longer interested.
No, fact-checkers are no longer being trusted anymore, are seen as biased. And
I'm not sure they're not trusted. I'm just saying their work is not dispositive. Yeah.
But anyway, my question was about something else. You said we live in a non-linear time of processing information. I was wondering if you could expound on that and how does that change our work?
In a what time of processing?
A non-linear time of processing information.
Oh, non-linear. Wow. It makes it really hard because content has now escaped context. So if you look online, and people aren't even, I recently read a headline, Google is for old people. I said, well, now I know I'm an old person. But this idea that like even people are moving, even in the era of Google, when we look for a search result, we don't really understand the publication's context, the outlet's context. We don't even understand the timing. So I think timing is a big part of it. When you look up facts on the internet, it could be something from 2018 that is completely out of date. And I'm looking obsessively at the date this was published, what is the source, what's the timing. The average person, it's just a flood of information. So what that means, I think, is that every item of content, every graphic, every article, every photo essay we produce has to have good metadata, but it has to have good contextualized information. And that includes, by the way, reminding people. Like we often assume, I hate this, when I was an editor, I would always say, please do not assume that someone read your last story about this subject. That's a very linear approach. Like I'm reading about abortion in Texas, so I'm gonna read every article by this reporter. That's not how people read. And so it doesn't mean don't do good reporting. It means that when we do good reporting, we have to link back to our previous work. We have to link out to other people's work, link out to resources more, and start to think about the article page and the text page. The text is just one element, that it has to have other elements that help to open the information and curiosity gap so that that item of data is not just sitting out there all alone. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sewell Chan.
Thank you.